A new message appeared. "Where is he?" Emily's fingers shook as she replied. "Still in Willow Park. Still waiting for the truth to come out." Another long pause. Then, "I'll come, but I can't promise anything." Emily exhaled, her heart pounding. She had done it. James was coming back. The next afternoon, Emily rushed to the park, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. Walter was there as always, but he looked different, more tired, more withdrawn. She hesitated before sitting beside him. "I found James," she said softly. Walter's head snapped up, his gray eyes searching hers for any sign of a lie. "What?" "He's coming," Emily said. "He wants to see you." Walter's hands trembled. For a long time he didn't speak. Then he whispered, "After all these years." They sat in silence until the sound of footsteps made them both turn. A man stood at the edge of the park. He was taller now, his face older, but Emily recognized him from the yearbook photo. James Halper. His gaze met Walter's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, James walked forward. Walter stood, his breath shaky. James swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember, Walter. I know the truth. The weight of years of silence, of pain, of injustice, hung in the air between them. And in that moment, Emily knew everything was about to change. A small-town girl with big questions, Emily Carter, had always been different from the rest of the folks in Maplewood. While most people in town were content with their quiet routines, early morning coffee at Millie's Diner, Sunday church services, and the same familiar faces at the grocery store, Emily had an insatiable curiosity that set her apart. She wasn't the type to accept things at face value. Ever since she was a child, she had an unshakable need to ask why. Why does the old clock tower only chime on some days? Why does Mr. Thompson always walk the long way around the town square instead of cutting through? Why does everyone in town act like Walter Briggs never existed? Questions like these had a way of annoying the adults around her. Even as a little girl, Emily sensed that some things were simply not to be questioned, but that only made her more determined. Her father, James Carter, had been the town's only journalist before he passed away unexpectedly when Emily was 12. He had run the Maplewood Gazette, a small but respectable newspaper that covered everything from local festivals to city council meetings. But what Emily admired most about him was his relentless pursuit of the truth. He always told her, "The truth isn't what people tell you it is, Em. It's what you dig up when no one's looking." After his death, Emily felt like a part of herself had been buried with him, but his words never left her. A mind that never stopped searching by the time Emily turned 25, she had inherited her father's love for uncovering hidden stories. She worked at the Maplewood Historical Society, cataloging old records, preserving town artifacts, and occasionally giving tours to visitors. It wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but she loved being surrounded by history. Unlike most people her age, she didn't dream of moving to the city or chasing fame. She felt there was something important in understanding the past, especially in a town like Maplewood, where secrets lingered in the air like whispers. It was during one of her routine days at the Historical Society that she first stumbled upon Walter Briggs. The name no one spoke, it started with an old town ledger. Emily had been sorting through records from the 1960s when she saw the name Walter Briggs deceased. The record was strange. Unlike most death records, which included a cause of death, Walter's was blank. There was no funeral notice in the town archives, no obituary, no family records. It was as if he had simply vanished. Curious, she asked Millie, the owner of the town diner, if she had ever heard of Walter Briggs. The woman's face went pale. "Where'd you hear that name?" Emily frowned. "Just an old record I found." Millie wiped her hands nervously on her apron. "Forget about it, honey. Some things are better left alone." That only fueled Emily's determination. She asked around, old-timers, shop owners, even the town librarian. But each time she mentioned Walter's name, she was met with the same response. Silence, avoidance, and in some cases fear. The story that didn't add up the more she searched, the stranger it became. According to the few fragments of information she managed to piece together, Walter Briggs had been accused of a terrible crime, one that supposedly shook Maplewood to its core. But when Emily tried to find out what exactly he had done, she hit a dead end. There were no police reports, no court records, no newspaper articles from the time mentioning his crime. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase him from history. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. If Walter had truly been guilty, why wasn't there a single shred of official evidence? And if he wasn't guilty, why had the town buried his name like a dirty secret? Why it mattered to Emily didn't know Walter Briggs. She had never met him, never heard about him until that day in the archives. But something about his story, or rather, the absence of his story, gnawed at her. She had seen the way the people in Maplewood avoided the truth. She had grown up watching her father fight to expose injustices, even when people told him to let things be. And now, she had stumbled upon something that felt like it had been deliberately hidden. She couldn't let it go. Her father had once told her, some truths are buried because people are afraid of what they'll find. Emily knew, without a doubt, that Walter Briggs' story was one of those truths. And no matter what it took, she was going to uncover it. Walter's life before the tragedy Walter Briggs wasn't always the town's buried secret. Once, he had been one of its most respected figures, a teacher, a mentor, and a man deeply invested in shaping the future of Maplewood's youth. His story wasn't just one of tragedy, but of trust betrayed, of a life that had been stolen before it truly had a chance to unfold. The dedicated teacher Walter had moved to Maplewood in the late 1950s, fresh out of college with a degree in education and a passion for literature. Teaching wasn't just a job to him, it was a calling. He believed that books had the power to shape young minds, to help them dream beyond the borders of their small town. At Maplewood High, Walter quickly became a favorite among students. Unlike the older, stricter teachers who demanded quiet obedience, Walter encouraged curiosity. He wanted his students to ask questions, to think critically, to challenge the world around them. Knowledge isn't about memorizing facts, he told his students. It's about understanding why things happen and what we can do with that understanding. His classroom was filled with books, novels, poetry, history, many of which he had bought with his own money. He hosted after-school reading sessions, helped struggling students find their confidence, and even fought to bring in a new curriculum that included diverse voices beyond the traditional textbooks. Not everyone in Maplewood appreciated his progressive approach, but the students adored him. One of those students was a boy named James Carter. Walter and James. A friendship beyond the classroom. James Carter had been a quiet, observant kid, the kind of boy who sat in the back of the classroom, listening more than speaking. Walter saw something in him, a spark of curiosity that reminded him of himself at that age. He encouraged James to write, to ask questions, to pursue the truth. When James expressed an interest in journalism, Walter loaned him books on investigative reporting, introduced him to great journalists, and even helped him start a small student newspaper. James flourished under Walter's guidance. He became more confident, more willing to challenge authority when something didn't seem right. Walter often told him, "The truth will always matter, even when people try to bury it." It was a lesson that James carried with him into adulthood, one that he would pass down to his daughter, Emily. The pivotal incident, everything changed in the summer of 1963. It started with a rumor, one that spread through town like wildfire. A young girl, the daughter of a prominent businessman, had gone missing for several hours. When she returned, shaken and frightened, whispers began to circulate. Someone had hurt her, they said. Someone had done something unforgivable. And somehow, Walter Briggs' name got caught in the storm. No one knew exactly how or why the accusation had started, but once it did, it couldn't be stopped. The town turned against him overnight. Parents who had once praised him now demanded his resignation. Students who admired him were told to stay away. The school board placed him on indefinite leave, pending an investigation that never seemed to fully materialize. James, by then a young journalist working for the local paper, didn't believe it. He knew Walter. He knew the kind of man he was. But when he tried to dig deeper, to find evidence, he found resistance at every turn. Police reports were vague. There were no formal charges, no trial, just whispers and assumptions. And then one day, Walter Briggs was gone. Some said he had left town in shame. Others claimed something darker had happened, that justice had been served in silence, away from the public eye. The truth was buried, and with it, the name of Walter Briggs disappeared from Maplewood's history. James's escape, James Carter, had always believed in the truth. He had been raised on stories of integrity, of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. But in the summer of 1963, when the town of Maplewood turned against Walter Briggs, James learned that the truth could be dangerous. He had been one of the only people who stood by Walter. While others whispered and turned away, James tried to investigate, to prove that the accusations were false. But what he uncovered wasn't just about Walter. It was about the town itself, and it almost got him killed. The beginning of the end, James had always known that Maplewood had its secrets. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, but certain things were never spoken about. Power was held by a select few, the old families, the ones with deep roots and deeper pockets. When Walter was accused, James sensed that something wasn't right. There was no real evidence, no formal charges, just rumors that had started somewhere and spread like wildfire. So he started digging. He spoke to anyone who would listen, but most were too afraid to talk. The girl who had been at the center of it all, the one who had gone missing and returned, had been sent away to stay with relatives. Her family refused to answer questions. The police reports were inconsistent. Some documents had been mysteriously misplaced. A few officers seemed uneasy when James pressed them for details. And then late one night, he got a warning, a call from an unknown voice, low and rough. "Leave it alone, Carter. Some things ain't meant to be uncovered." James wasn't the kind of person who scared easily, but this was different. This wasn't just about Walter anymore. This was bigger. The attack the night before he planned to publish his findings in the local paper. James was walking home when he noticed a car trailing him. At first, he told himself he was imagining things. But as he turned onto a side street, the headlights brightened and the car sped up. He ran. He barely made it to his apartment before the car skidded to a stop. He could hear footsteps, more than one person. His hands trembled as he locked the door. Then the pounding started. Bam, bam, bam. "Come out, Carter." He didn't. Instead, he grabbed the bag he had already packed. Somewhere deep down, he had known this was coming. He had been making enemies. He had been pushing too hard. He didn't stay to find out what they would do if he opened the door. Through the back window, he climbed down the fire escape, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran through the alley, his breath ragged, his legs burning. He could hear them behind him. Shouts, footsteps, the sound of doors slamming. They were chasing him, and if they caught him, he knew he wouldn't live to see morning. The escaped James didn't stop running until he reached the train station. He had enough money for a ticket, barely enough to get him out of state. He didn't care where the train was going. He just needed to disappear. As the train pulled away from Maplewood, he watched the town fade into the distance, knowing he could never go back. Walter was gone. The truth had been buried. And now, James Carter was a ghost. For years, he moved from place to place, never staying too long. He took small reporting jobs under fake names, always careful, always looking over his shoulder. The years passed, and eventually, he found himself in a quiet town on the East Coast, working at a small newspaper under a new identity. He had built a life, a family. He had a daughter now, Emily. But he never forgot, and he never stopped fearing the day that the past would catch up to him. What he didn't know was that Emily would one day find the truth. And when she did, the ghost of Maplewood would rise again. The town secret's Maplewood had always been the kind of town where secrets thrived in the shadows, wrapped in whispered conversations and knowing glances. On the surface, it was a quiet, picturesque place, a town where people smiled at each other on the streets, where the scent of fresh bread from the local bakery drifted through the air, and where the church bells rang every Sunday morning without fail. But beneath that surface was something far darker. And when the rumors about Walter Briggs began to spread, no one questioned them. Because in Maplewood, the truth was whatever the powerful wanted it to be. The birth of a scandal had started as a whisper, a few hushed words in the corner of the diner, a lingering glance exchanged between two townsfolk on the church steps, a mother pulling her child closer as Walter walked past. And then almost overnight, it became fact. Walter Briggs, once a respected teacher, a man who had dedicated his life to education, was now something else entirely. People spoke of his odd behavior, of the way he kept to himself. They dredged up old, meaningless details, twisting them into something sinister. Someone mentioned that he had never married, as if that alone was proof of guilt. The most damning accusation came when a young girl, the daughter of a prominent family, went missing for 2 days and then returned, silent and withdrawn. No one knew exactly what had happened, but when her parents started looking for someone to blame, the town was all too willing to provide an answer. Walter. No one asked for evidence. No one needed it, because in Maplewood, truth wasn't about proof. It was about perception. The power of fear, once the rumor took hold, it became unstoppable. Parents pulled their children from Walter's classes. People crossed the street to avoid him. The men at the bar stopped greeting him with nods and handshakes. Even those who had once called him a friend grew distant, not because they believed he was guilty, but because it was easier to stay silent than to stand against the tide. The town had a way of punishing those who didn't fall in line. Businesses mysteriously lost customers. Jobs became harder to keep. Doors that had once been open suddenly shut without explanation. And so, no one defended Walter. Not publicly, at least. The hidden hands behind the rumors, James Carter, had always suspected that the accusations against Walter weren't random. The more he looked into it, the more he realized that someone with power, was guiding the narrative. The girl's father, Richard Holloway, was one of the wealthiest men in town. His family had controlled much of Maplewood's economy for generations. He owned land, businesses, and, most importantly, influence. James had no doubt that if Richard wanted someone gone, all he had to do was plant the right seed in the right ear. And that's exactly what he had done with Walter. But why? That was the question James never got to answer. Because before he could uncover the full truth, he was forced to run for his life. The silence that followed after Walter was gone, after his house was abandoned, his name erased, Maplewood did what it always did. It moved on. The people who had spread the rumors never spoke of him again. The town cleaned up the mess as if it had never happened. The missing girl was sent away to live with relatives. Whatever she knew, whatever had truly happened to her, remained buried. And those who had doubted the accusations, but had been too afraid to speak, they lived with their silence. Because in Maplewood, the past had a way of staying hidden, until someone came looking for it. And that someone was Emily Carter. Emily begins her investigation. Emily Carter had never been the kind of person to let things go. It was a trait that had served her well as a journalist, but it was also the reason she never felt at home in Maplewood. The town thrived on silence, on unspoken rules that no one dared to break. But Emily wasn't like the others. She had always questioned things, and now, as she stood in the dusty old archives of the Maplewood Library, she knew she was about to do something no one else had dared. She was going to uncover the truth about Walter Briggs. Digging into the past, Emily had never met Walter. He had been gone before she was even born, but she had grown up hearing whispers about him. He was the town's unspoken ghost, a name people avoided, a chapter of history everyone had agreed to forget. But Emily's uncle James hadn't forgotten. His stories had been the spark that lit her curiosity, but it wasn't until she stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping that her curiosity turned into something more. It was a small article buried deep in the archives of the Maplewood Gazette, dated nearly 3 decades earlier. Local teacher disappears amid controversy. It was short, just a few paragraphs. It mentioned vague accusations, a town divided, and then nothing. No follow-up, no trial, no resolution. Just silence. Emily frowned as she scanned the paper again. Even the language felt deliberate. Carefully chosen words meant to suggest guilt without actually proving anything. It was clear that the truth had been buried. But by whom? And why? Talking to the townspeople, Emily knew she needed more than old articles. She needed real stories, real memories. And that meant talking to the people who had been there. Her first stop was Margaret Holloway, the town librarian. Margaret had been working at the library since before Emily was born, and if anyone had information, it would be her. Walter Briggs. Margaret's face tensed at the mention of the name. I haven't heard that name in years. Emily leaned in. What do you remember about him? Margaret hesitated. Then, in a low voice, she said, He was a good teacher. One of the best we had. Emily raised an eyebrow. That's not what I was expecting. Margaret sighed, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Most people only remember the scandal. They don't remember the man. Emily pulled out her notebook. Tell me about him. Margaret hesitated again. But then, as if she had been waiting years for someone to ask, she began to talk. Walter had been passionate about teaching. He had cared about his students, pushed them to think critically, encouraged them to dream beyond the small town. But then the accusations came. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. The thing is, Emily, not everyone believed them. Emily's pulse quickened. Then why didn't anyone speak up? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Because in Maplewood, speaking up can cost you everything. That was the moment Emily knew she was onto something much bigger than just an old scandal. Stumbling upon inconsistencies, the more Emily dug, the more things didn't add up. She spoke to an old farmer, Henry Dawson, who had been one of Walter's neighbors. He told her that the night Walter disappeared, he had seen figures outside Walter's house. Figures dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly. That wasn't no man leaving on his own, Henry muttered. That was someone being taken. Then there was Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman who used to run the local diner. She remembered how quickly people had turned on Walter. It happened overnight, she said. One day, he was respected. The next, he was a villain. Just like that. Emily pressed. Do you remember who started the rumors? Mrs. Calloway hesitated. Richard Holloway had a hand in it. Everyone knew that. Emily had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach tighten. Richard Holloway, a man with power, money, and influence. A man who had been involved in the scandal, but had never faced any consequences. Emily was beginning to see a pattern, and that's when she found the police report. Or rather, the lack of one. Despite all the accusations, despite the disappearance, there was no formal police report filed against Walter Briggs. No records of an investigation. No documented evidence of wrongdoing. Nothing. It was as if the entire thing had been fabricated. Emily sat back, heart pounding. Walter Briggs had never been proven guilty. He had simply been erased. And now, after all these years, Emily was determined to find out why. Emily stood at the edge of Maplewood's town square, the cold wind biting against her skin as she gripped the old folder in her hands. It was filled with everything she had uncovered, the testimonies, the inconsistencies, the missing police report, and, most importantly, the truth. Walter Briggs had been innocent. The accusations had been a fabrication, a web of lies spun by Richard Holloway to eliminate a man who had dared to challenge the town status quo. Walter had been taken, disappeared by the people who wanted him gone. And yet, no one had questioned it. Until now. Emily took a deep breath and stepped into the town hall, where a community meeting was taking place. Conversations quieted as heads turned toward her, Suspicion thick in the air. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she had come too far to back down now. She walked to the front and laid the folder on the podium. "I know the truth about Walter Briggs." A murmur spread through the crowd, some shifting uncomfortably, others shaking their heads. Richard Holloway's son, now the town's mayor, stood near the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Emily continued, her voice steady. Walter was framed. The accusations were never investigated, never proven. And yet he was exiled, forced out of his own home. Why? She let her gaze sweep across the room. Because one man had enough power to silence everyone else. The room was silent. Then Margaret Holloway, the librarian who had hesitated to speak before, rose from her seat. "She's right," she said softly. "We all knew something wasn't right, but we were too afraid to say anything." Others began nodding. A few murmured in agreement. Henry Dawson, the old farmer, cleared his throat. "I saw them take him. I should have done something." Emily's chest tightened. For the first time, the weight of silence was beginning to lift. But not everyone was willing to face the truth. The mayor stepped forward, his jaw tight. "What do you expect us to do now? Bring back a dead man?" Emily held his gaze. "I expect you to acknowledge what happened, to give Walter Briggs the justice he never got." The mayor scoffed, but the tide had already turned. Days later, an official statement was made. Walter Briggs' name was cleared, his legacy restored. The town of Maplewood could no longer pretend he had never existed. As Emily stood by her Uncle James' side, watching as a memorial was placed in Walter's honor, she felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Justice had come too late for Walter, but the truth had finally won, and Maplewood would never forget again.